I'm going to be talking to Janet Brown of Janet Brown Opinion Research about public opinion in Alberta heading into the May election, and public opinion about the energy transition and oil and gas, what Albertans are thinking about it these days. And especially, I think at the end of we'll talk a little bit about how that might play into the election campaign, which will start up. Well, really, it's underway now, but the election is scheduled for May 29th. So welcome to the interview, Janet.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Now, look, I interviewed you and a colleague of yours 3 or 4 years ago. And
Hmm.
you said something during that interview that has stuck with me ever since. And that is Albertans are oil and gas. They identify so closely with the industry, with the ethos around oil and gas. Is that still the case?
Absolutely, it's still the case. But it's funny, like when you ask people in a survey whether they work directly in oil and gas or not, usually we get about 10% of people saying they work directly in the industry. So it's not that we're all living and breathing it day to day. It's only a small proportion of the population that, like, their meals directly come from that. But Albertans are really are very, very conscious of of the knock-on effect of energy. And we're going to have a budget later this month. And the budget is so closely tied to oil and gas prices, and everybody in Alberta knows that. I mean, in other parts of Canada, you wake up and you listen to what the forecast is for the day. In Alberta, we wake up and we listen for what oil and gas prices are.
Now, I was having a conversation with a colleague over the weekend, and we were discussing this. And the perception is that in Calgary, of the two big cities between Calgary and Edmonton, Calgary is the one, and it's where I lived for 10 years. So I kind of feel I know the culture
Mhm.
there a little bit better. Is there's a sense that everybody, not just people who work directly in the oil and gas industry, but everybody feels that their personal financial situation, their personal economic situation, rises and falls with the oil and gas tides. Now, is that feeling still as strong today as it was, say, 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Well, it's probably overstating it that everybody feels that way. I mean, if you're a teacher or a nurse or something, your salary is not going to go up and down. Your bonus isn't going to go up and down. So I don't know that I don't want to overstate the case, but yeah, I think there's definitely a sense of, before the pandemic, the office towers in downtown Calgary started to clear out in the downturn, and that was a big issue in Calgary, was vacancies in the downtown core. And that had an effect because downtown wasn't quite as vibrant a place. The city wasn't getting the tax dollars it needed from the downtown core. So people who lived in the suburbs were looking at property tax increases because of the loss of so those are the kind of, not, like I said, knock-on effects. So even if you don't work in oil and gas day to day, everybody's conscious of what the knock-on effects can be for the city and for the population.
Now, you did some surveying late last fall for the CBC, I think,
Yes.
and at least that's where I found it. And
Mhm.
you mentioned that the Albertans are much more accepting now of the energy transition. They understand that this is a global process. It's been going on for a while. It's accelerating. They've seen what's happened during the pandemic. They've seen what happened after Russia invaded Ukraine. So they're more accepting of a future with less oil. But while they're more accepting, they still expect oil to play a big role in the Alberta economy, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road.
Well, here's how I'd characterize public opinion in this regard. Most Albertans understand the need to transition. Most Albertans support the idea of transition. Like 2/3 of Albertans, think moving towards net zero, whether it's 2030 or 2050, but at least the direction of net zero is an important goal to pursue. That's about 2/3 of Albertans agree with that. A large number of Albertans think that that our economy will actually be better after we transition. That's actually the future to having a strong economy in the future. The problem for Albertans is the discussion about timing. So I think Albertans have moved on from the discussion about whether this is a worthy goal or not, and now they want to talk about the timing. And so I'm sure we're going to get into just transition and stuff like that. This is what gets Albertans anxious is, yes, we have to move in that direction, but does the federal government and the rest of the country want us to move faster than is realistic, faster than our economy can accommodate, and actually faster than technology can accommodate? And the other thing I'd say that sort of makes Alberta a little bit different from the rest of the country is there's this sense outside of the country that we're going to get to net zero by phasing out oil and gas. And Albertans don't see it that way for the most part. I mean, I'm speaking in generalities, but Albertans are really excited about the potential of technology, right? So for Alberta, transition isn't so much about getting out of oil and gas. It's exploring things like hydrogen and carbon capture and new technology. So this is what makes out the goal. We're okay with the goal. It's the timing and the mechanism for getting there.
I've interviewed Frank Graves from Ecos Research and David Coletto from Abacus Data about some of their take on anxious voters. And this disruption in the energy system, they say, shows up in their data as more anxious conservatives, but also more anxious progressives in Alberta than any other province. Does your data show something similar?
Oh, absolutely. And it goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning was, 10% of the population say that someone in their household works directly in oil and gas. The rest of us feel some sort of add-on effect. So, it is that difference. It's just closer to home. These are not theoretical discussions among Albertans. They're real discussions, right? And when, and of course, there's a lot of controversy because the UCP wanted to sort of spin the potential job losses as actually being bigger than the entire workforce in Alberta. But when you talk big numbers to people, it doesn't really matter, right? It doesn't matter whether you're talking about 100 jobs or 1,000 jobs or 10,000 jobs. What matters is if you're talking about my job or the potential for my kids to get a job when they go into the workforce. So, it's kind of the difference between microeconomics and macroeconomics, right? Like it's like it's so much more personal here. And I don't think anybody should be surprised that Albertans have a level of anxiety around this stuff when it hits so close to home.
Yeah, I would agree. What I know about Calgary in particular, your observations make perfect sense to me. Now, one of the things that came out in your November research that I found absolutely fascinating was that there are changes in the political landscape in some of the mid-sized cities in Alberta. And I think the way you phrased it, if I have this correct, is that the mid-sized cities are starting to look more like Edmonton and Calgary, more moderate. Is that accurate?
So what I'd say is they're starting to look more like Calgary. And Calgary does not look like Edmonton. So they're starting to look more like Calgary. So, which you have to sort of understand about Alberta. And I always feel people outside of Alberta just don't appreciate what a diverse population we have here. And that's because the stereotypes of Alberta are so strong that it's easy just to kind of assume that Alberta is this monolith. But, we're a really unique province in that we've got these two major cities of almost equal size, right? Like, you can do a poll in Vancouver and have a pretty good idea how BC is going to go. You can do a poll in Toronto, but here in Calgary, here in Alberta, we've got these two big cities. And politically speaking, Alberta and Edmonton and Calgary are so vastly, vastly different. Now, as this election approaches, right? My claim to fame is I had a more accurate poll in the last 2019 Alberta election than anybody else. And gosh, I hope I get the popular vote right. But actually, it's so much more complicated right now that getting the popular vote may not actually predict who's going to win the election. What's going on here politically is like Edmonton's kind of wrapped up, right? Like I'm going to be surprised if every single seat doesn't go to the NDP. It's pretty well wrapped up. Outside, and the towns and the rural areas, they're pretty wrapped up. They look like they're going to go to the UCP. So what's at stake in this election is Calgary and those smaller cities like Red Deer and Lethbridge. And so that's what I'm going to be really looking at. And when we did the data for CBC, Jason Markusoff wrote a great article, and I think the term he used is, is Red Deer looking more like Calgary? Is more like Calgary and less like Coronation? And that's what we're all waiting to see is those mid-sized cities. Do they focus on their concerns around healthcare, their serious problems happening at the the Red Deer Hospital? Do they focus on those kind of issues, or do they focus on economic issues, and that'll predict how they vote? And my calculation is, if the NDP is going to get to a majority, they probably have to get one of those Red Deer seats, and they probably have to get both of the Lethbridge seats, and they probably have to get 16 out of 25 of the Calgary seats. So this we keep calling it's battleground Calgary, and secondarily battleground small cities.
One of my observations from 2019, Janet, was the UCP, when Jason Kenney was leading the UCP at that time, had a very strong energy narrative. It was the jobs pipeline.
Jobs economy pipeline. He stood in front of a
go.
podium. Jobs economy pipelines. He stood in front of a podium that said just that.
Exactly right. And he went all over the province, and he had a very simple message. It was, that the NDP their policy had injured and hurt the oil and gas industry, and he was going to reverse those policies and put in place policies that would support new jobs. It was it was a powerful narrative. I remember covering it at the time, and the NDP didn't have a counter to it. And I already see some of the Premier Smith's, her advisors on social media cranking up that narrative, a very similar narrative again. And I wonder, is that likely? How would that play in Calgary and those medium-sized cities like Lethbridge and Red Deer?
Well, it's not going to be so cut and dry as it was in 2019. So I have this graph I love to show at presentations, and it's, we ask people in surveys, what do you think are the most important issues facing Alberta? We don't give them any categories. It's completely open-ended, and then we code their answers afterwards. So when we asked that question in 2015, when the NDP won a majority government, the top two issues were health and education, right? And so when Albertans were preoccupied with health and education, they elected an NDP government. Jobs economy pipelines, when they were solely focused on the economy, they elected a UCP government. Now, when we ask that question, healthcare is number one, inflation is a close second, and then the third category we hear about is kind of like good government, just like let's get rid of the chaos in government, that sort of thing. So where Jason Kenney stood at a podium that said jobs economy pipelines, the person who wants to be the next premier should be standing in front of a podium that says healthcare, inflation, good government. So it's not so cut and dry now. And in 2019, I remember doing an analysis for CBC Calgary, and we looked at people's social values and we looked at their economic values. And what we found was that if people were conservative in one dimension, either their conservative values, their economic values, or both, they were likely going to vote UCP. The NDP was at an advantage because voters had to be both socially progressive and economically progressive to have the NDP on their shopping list. And what we found was that people who were socially progressive were sort of willing to ignore their social concerns and vote according to their economic concerns, right? Like their economic concerns were so front and center. Like I said, it's more complicated now. And this is why I think we're going to have a late night on election night, is because, voters are probably going to flip back and forth between now and the time of the election, deciding, am I going to vote based on my social values, or am I going to vote based on my economic values?
Well, Janet, that fascinating insights. And over the next 3 months or so, as we head into the silly season of the campaign, we'll be coming back to you to get more of those insights. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you so much for having me.